maybe that was I got a little too literal with it there, but yeah.
Maybe we won't include that part.
Yeah,
I don't know. Yeah. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Real History. I am your host, Jared Frederick, and I am joined by my good friend for this episode, Rich Condon. Rich, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me today.
Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and why you are a good authority figure to talk about our film selection for today.
So my name is Rich Condon. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, currently living in Gettysburg. Previously I had worked at a national park called Reconstruction Era National Historical Park, where I started in 2020, just as the pandemic was starting to get underway, and was there until about a month and a half, 2 months ago. At this park in particular, we looked at how Reconstruction started in the South Carolina Lowcountry, but used that as kind of a jumping off point to discuss it across the nation.
And accordingly, what film have we chosen today?
The Free State of Jones.
And we previously did a short episode of Real History at the Reconstruction Park, and we briefly talked about this film. And for reasons that we'll be discussing, we are of the mind that this is probably the best cinematic depiction of Reconstruction that there is. Not that that says a lot, given Hollywood's track record with it. So, let's go ahead, dive right in, and take a look at Free State of Jones.
Stay with me!
Go for it.
Hold that right!
I have to say, as someone who appreciates material culture and someone who has previously done living history, maybe one of my least favorite things about the movie is kind of what you're seeing here, and some of the uniforms, even some of the ways that the soldiers are even formed up and attacking in formation, or not formation.
Yeah. This movie does not rank high in regard to material culture, uniforms, military tactics. They really, in my mind, needed the assistance of an on-set military advisor.
Absolutely.
All that said, though, as we see here from these very grisly vignettes, where it lacks accuracy in material culture and military formations, it certainly makes up for it in the grisly carnage.
Absolutely.
That it shows. And so I think that's the big takeaway that audiences will have. They will not be looking at the correct type of shell jackets or be looking for that. But wow, this is really violent and big and chaotic.
Right.
They think you an officer. They'll fix you soon. Here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Go into the hospital scenes here. We are introduced to the main character, Matthew McConaughey, hey, who plays Newton Knight. What do you know about Newton Knight?
Newton Knight has a pretty interesting background, as we'll find out throughout the film. Enlisting in the Confederate Army. Of course, I think this is supposed to be the fight at Corinth.
Correct.
Here that we're seeing in the opening scenes. And not too long after, deserts the Confederate Army, goes back home to Jones County, Mississippi, where he basically goes into hiding in some of the swamps with escaped enslaved people, begins a revolt in Jones County, Mississippi, and basically try to secede from a state that had seceded from the United States. But what's really fascinating, I think, is his life after the war.
Yes,
as we'll see later
which
on.
we will be getting into. So, for the purposes of his character's development, he's in this phase of disillusionment.
Right.
At the outset. And gets into some really interesting conversations with his comrade Jasper, who is a real-life individual.
Since when?
First, I guess. New conscription act. Poor man's fighting a rich man's war.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a whole lot of people coming to this realization like he is initially. Maybe until later in the war. I mean, at this point, these guys realize that they're kind of in this for the long haul, though, as well, right? They're not signing enlistment papers for, say, 3 years. They're signing up until the deal is done, until in their eyes they've won their independence.
I ain't fighting for cotton. I'm fighting for honor.
Oh, that's good, Will. I sure hate to be fighting for cotton.
I think in this scene right here, we see Newt and Jasper kind of, especially Newt, of course, kind of rising above what other people perceive they're fighting for at this point in the war.
Mm-hmm. And these conversations around the campfire poke holes in the lost cause mythos of the war, where you have the one soldier say, "I'm fighting for honor," and Newton Knight says, "Yeah, sure you are." Yeah. So it pulls the Moonlight and Magnolia's mystique
back a little bit.
out from under audiences very, very quickly, just a few minutes into the movie here.
Come here. Hey. What happened?
They took me, and they took the mule, our hogs, half the corn crib. They told me I'd been drafted.
Newt's cousin that we're introduced to here is in fact not a real person.
Okay.
And he's an amalgamation of sorts of different characters who Knight probably would have come in contact with in his Mississippi battalion. And we get this sort of home front perspective through him, like what's going on back home as men like Newt are up on the front lines fighting.
I think it's also a good personification of innocence being lost, is kind of, we'll see what happens in the next couple of scenes with Daniel as well.
We're gonna get out of this trench. We're gonna make for a tree line about a quarter mile out.
As we head into the trenches of Corinth here, I do think it is a very interesting representation. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of complexity to the set dressing. It resembles kind of World War I trench warfare
A little bit,
as well. But Corinth, located in northern Mississippi, was a vital railroad's crossroads. And this war is about infrastructure. I mean, it's about roads, it's about railroads, it's about ports. And the likes of Corinth figures into those larger strategic calculations of the war.
50 yards out. That's where we head. Ready? Go! Stay behind me.
As Newt is taking Daniel out into the battlefield, I think this is another good moment where perhaps a military advisor could have been used, because you can't just transfer from the ambulance corps one day and decide you want to go and join up and fight an infantry regiment just because your kin arrives and you feel obligated to look after him. And what are they doing here? Like, you can't just send two people out at random out into no man's land to go hither and yon. This makes no sense whatsoever.
I remember
what they're doing.
The first time I'd seen this movie, it was one of my first thoughts is, why are they just moving independently of kind of their larger company, just moving across the battlefield for what seems like no apparent reason?
Yeah.
So
it's definitely one of the initial weaknesses of the film.
Whoa. Down.
Who you with?
Mississippi 5th. F Company. We're all that's left.
All right. You with us now. We're making for that ridge over to the right.
If they're all that's left, why are they going out here searching for somebody? Makes no sense whatsoever. We're going to do a 5-man bayonet charge here.
I got a boy here. I got a boy here. I got officers I can't even get to.
As we revisit the hospital scene here, I forgot to point out earlier in the first hospital scene, we see a Southern woman comforting one of the wounded soldiers, reading scripture to him. And that is actually a cameo by Victoria Bynum, who is the author of Free State of Jones, the inspiration for this story. So obviously you got to check out the book. And the book goes very much into the genealogy and cross lineage and political and military affiliations
Right.
of the Knight family as it grows later on. The book takes a somewhat different route than certain elements of the movie.
And as we were talking about, Newt's story earlier on, and I mentioned, his life after the war is quite interesting. That's really what I think drew her in, as you mentioned, the genealogy of it all, as we'll see here later on.
And I die. And I die. And I die.
Because here they have a, fictional character dying, and that kind of is the catalyst where he says, all right, that's it, I'm done.
The historical record indicates Newt went back home at least once or twice before he deserted. He had a family member who died. He apparently got permission to go home, and I think when he did go home, he really gained a sense of the plight of his kin and his townsfolk, that they were being the victims of Confederate marauders who were out scavenging the countryside. And all of these things ultimately dominoed into his desertion. And so it wasn't merely the fact that he's grown weary of the war, that his comrades are dying, but he also has this acute sense of the shortcomings and deprivations that folks back in Jones County are enduring.
He's all cool now. Probably going to sleep a while. He's fine.
So in these nursing scenes, we get a fuller introduction to a woman who will play a very large role in Newt's life, and that is an enslaved woman by the name of Rachel. Rachel, according to records, would have been about 22, 23 years of age at this time. Newt himself would have been in his mid-20s, so Matthew McConaughey is about 20 years older than what the actual Newt Knight would. A common theme that we see in all war films, people who are too old to be playing the characters that they are. But all that said, people aged a lot quicker in the 1860s when you look at photographs of them. And he does bear a very strong resemblance to him.
He really does.
I think all things considered, it's very good casting on the part of the filmmakers.
I can't take that.
Yes, you can.
But saving a life ain't easy. Yeah. And when you do, it's something special. Thank you.
You hear about a lot of interpretive programs when we go to, say, national parks, and a lot of them are themed around, Civil War to civil rights. This one kind of takes a bit of a interesting turn where I see it as Civil War to segregation, as you're seeing in the courtroom here with his descendant.
And I think that was one thing that threw some audience members for a loop. Like, what are these flash forwards that go ahead 85 years? And I had read the book before the movie came out, so I knew what was coming and I knew what that was all about. Mm-hmm. But for audience members who hadn't read the book and weren't more familiar with the story, I think it led to some confusion on their part. So perhaps that was one of the things that critics found fault with. But ultimately, it's hinted to the audience, oh, okay, he's going to have children with this enslaved woman, and it's going to lead to ripple effects for their descendants in the forthcoming years.
What happened?
They told me gather up all the clothes and blankets. They'd be back for them in an hour. They told me round up all the hogs I got and put them in a pen.
Who did?
The cavalry officer and the
tax agent.
And I think another interesting movie that reflects on this sort of terror that unfolded on the southern home front is Cold Mountain.
Oh, absolutely.
The characters in that movie are even more sadistic. It can be opened up to interpretation whether or not that's realistic or not. But suffice it to say that there were a lot of shortcomings and challenges here on the southern home front.
You think I ain't alone? Why you always gotta fight everyone else's fight for them? Can't do this anymore, Nate. Can't. fresh powder on.
I think what these scenes also kind of expose us to, on kind of a larger scale, is, you know, when people were taught about the Civil War in school, and I can, you know, speak from personal experience in Western Pennsylvania, it's taught that the Civil War is very cut and dry, of course, North versus South, but people are as complicated back then as they are today, and that you don't necessarily have everybody south of the Mason-Dixon line aligning with the same ideals as, say, the Confederate government, as we're seeing right here.
And the fact that 100,000 white Southerners join up in United States military forces
Right.
is testimony to that. And people in Confederate states, with the exception of South Carolina, send young men to fight on behalf of the Stars and Stripes rather than the Stars and Bars. So not everything is as, shall we say, black and white an issue as we're often presented in the simplified terms of middle school.
Right. And vice versa, you know, young men from the North, I can think of a handful from Pennsylvania, for example, are heading south to join Confederate units.
Nor was everybody in the North supportive of the war effort.
Right.
We only need to look at the Copperhead movement.
I was going to mention real quick about the animal attack, though.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
That's
with the dog.
Right. I think that's a scene which kind of lends itself to Newton really finding some kind of empathy with enslaved people, because, you know, if you look at so many who have self-emancipated or escaped slavery, among their enemies in the wild are attack hounds like that. And of course, him being wounded sends him into the swamp with a group of self-emancipated people.
It's something like an odyssey that he's going on, because at first there's disillusionment over the war, and then there is this epiphany of empathy, as you highlight, where he realizes, oh, you know what, I have a lot more in common with these enslaved people than I do the folks who are running the plantations. And it certainly speaks, going all the way back to Bacon's rebellion, for crying out loud, in the 17th century, how race is used as a wedge issue to keep people who otherwise have a lot in common divided. It's still done today.
Right.
That's some fresh plantain.
Mr. Newt.
Moses, whose own character development is fascinating, as we'll see as we're moving out throughout the movie, where you're seeing him, you know, with a tool of oppression still strapped around his neck from his time being enslaved, and then we'll see kind of his progress into the Reconstruction era, which is, I think, a really good illustration of the experience of millions of African Americans going from that period of enslavement to navigating freedom, 1865 and later.
And we can find a number of photographs with showcasing similar contraptions like Moses is wearing here. So the reality there is quite stark. It's worth mentioning, though, that here too, Moses is another fictional character.
Right.
And we can presume that Newt had interactions with men like Moses, but for the sake of the storyline and creating a sense of camaraderie among the characters,
Right.
we see another composite individual here. These sorts of narrative decisions, I think, speak to one of the problems of the subject matter, because if you go to Jones, Mississippi today, I think people have very differing opinions on him. And additionally, so much of his activity is cloaked in myth, folklore.
Right.
I think it's hard for a lot of people, even his descendants, to fully determine what he did and did not do.
I was going to ask, you know, how much documentation do we really have about his interactions with, say, local African Americans in Jones County?
I think a lot of it is presumed,
Right.
going from the historical record. But I think an apt analogy, and when I've shown this film in the classroom in my Civil War cinema class, we can very much liken him to this Robin Hood of the Confederacy.
Right.
Here we see his band of merry men living in Sherwood Forest. We see the mean sheriff in the form of Lieutenant Barber
Right.
coming after him, but not daring to go into the woods, wanting to fight Robin Hood on his own terms, so to speak. And of course, Newt believes that he's highly involved in the fight against political and economic oppression. So it's almost like this fabled bit of mythical folklore.
I never thought about it that way, but that's a really good parallel.
I think this leads to a very interesting question. As we see this big pile of shotguns being smuggled into the swamp here, what do you think the chances are that they would have been able to acquire so many weapons so easily?
Not easy.
Yeah. What's the greatest fear of a plantation owner during the Civil War era?
An armed African American.
Yeah. So, if you have 6 shotguns go missing, that's a huge
That raises a large red flag.
Yeah,
right.
so probably not very likely. Maybe one you could get away with,
Right.
but a whole bundle of them, probably not.
Well, when I see that too, I think of, John Brown's raid in 1859. I mean, what's he arming his men with as they're going
Pikes.
into Harper's Ferry? Right, pikes.
Because you presume that they don't know how to use
Right.
weapons. But when we see Newt hammering away at the neck chain around Moses' neck, it leads to an important narrative conversation, I think. It's something that some critics, perhaps unjustly, accuse this movie of. Is this merely another white savior movie?
Right.
Is Glory a white savior movie? Do these sorts of depictions, even though this is fairly true, broadly speaking, in regard to the storyline, do films like this deprive African Americans of the sort of agency involved with self-emancipation? What are your thoughts on something like that?
I think that is a really good question. When we look at, like you said, Glory, I do think, because, especially the time period that it came out, it is kind of a white savior movie. We have these characters, like in that case, Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington, for example, who are kind of living in the peripheral, just as Moses is in this movie. Now, if Moses was featured as the main character, that's a different story. But I think this could absolutely fall in line with kind of how Glory portrays African Americans as well. It's a step in the right direction, but I feel like, if, of course, it wasn't centered around Newt, him being the central character, you could say differently. But, then again, in the 1860s, many abolitionists kind of paint themselves that way as well. And you read the journal of Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the colonel of the 1st South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, self-proclaimed well-known abolitionist, has his heart in the right place. But if you read his letters and his journal entries, it's very paternalistic, very, very white savior, when he's looking at these men who were once enslaved in the South Carolina Sea Islands.
So it may not meet people's modern tastes, but it's how many people saw themselves and how people frame situations and understandings of the time period.
Right.
So it is what it is.
Did you get him? Get him again.
I do like how the movie also kind of provides a chronological timeline as we're moving through the Civil War into Reconstruction.
How do you feel about the incorporation of these black and white photographs throughout the film? Does that transport us to the time, or is it sort of a distraction from the narrative, do you think?
As a historian, I appreciate it. Does the general public appreciate it? I don't know. I feel like I'm being transported back to Ken Burns' 1989 documentary a little bit, even with kind of the same font as they're flashing across the screen.
I have no doubt. And it's worth mentioning that the director of this movie, Gary Ross, about 15 years before this film, he made Seabiscuit.
Right, okay, yeah.
And Seabiscuit also had those similar sort of cutaways to give context about the Great Depression.
Okay.
And who narrated those little breakaways?
Was it David McCullough?
It was David McCullough. So Gary Ross is definitely a student of Ken Burns, which perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that things like that are incorporated here.
Interesting.
Raise your hand. That stuff don't belong to you. Unhitch that wagon and head off down the road.
Who are you?
One of the things I don't understand about the interactions among these characters, Newt keeps having these interactions, these showdowns with Lieutenant Barber, and he keeps letting him go.
Right.
Like, he encounters him like 3 or 4 times throughout the movie. Just shoot the guy if he's so bad and you don't want to mess with him further. So I think there too, it strays from the reality that for the sake of having this cohesive villain throughout the whole story, he keeps being let go. And maybe it alludes to knight's chivalry. Maybe he is a knight, you know? Maybe there's something like that being invoked here.
What do you say to Summerall?
Well, there will be no more dry firing for you.
So we see William Sumrall with that great handlebar mustache being kind of reintroduced here. You know, this guy who during the fighting around Corinth says that he's fighting for honor, but now we see him in the same swamp as Newton and you know, these freed people who are hiding out, becoming part of this larger resistance here in Jones County, Mississippi. So what's he fighting for now?
I think he's still fighting for his honor, but the definition of honor has changed.
Right.
Before it was a regional or national honor, and now it's about personal dignity.
Right.
About self-worth. What am I worth as a man? What am I going to fight for in that context?
And it's kind of it's raised that meaning to a completely different plane. Mm-hmm. It's not quite as surface level as it was in those first scenes of the movie.
What you sow, you should reap. What you put in the ground, you should take out of the ground. What you say we go out there and we pick it clean? There's 100 of us, yeah? We pick it clean all one day. We do that? Yeah. We pick it clean. We hide it away. We divide it amongst ourselves later on. Meanwhile, by the time they get down here, we done scattered.
These scenes of the crops being gathered, they do remind me of other stories where Southerners would bury their valuables like in the flower bed or something.
Okay, yeah.
We typically think of these stories and these actions being done in reaction to Union soldiers.
Right.
But we once again see that it's a little bit more complex than that.
Right.
Oh, you might be hiding stuff from your own side, so they can't get what you think is rightfully yours. So it adds some nuance, I think.
Right. Or, you know, you hear stories of, you know, U.S. troops finding some kind of bounty in the South. And I'm going to use, for example, I believe the bell from the firehouse or the fire station at Harper's Ferry. Soldiers of the 13th Massachusetts Infantry confiscating it, and I believe they had buried it somewhere in the local area, came back later on to retrieve it and take it back to Massachusetts.
And it's still there.
Yeah, right. And it is kind of interesting to think about, you know, depriving the enemy or other people of what you see as valuable. There are a couple accounts off the top of my head from Beaufort, South Carolina, from the time that I worked there, of locals hiding their silver and things like that in the ground behind the smokehouse and coming back, you know, in 1865 and onward to retrieve it.
Like that, huh?
It's just some corn. You kill a man for some corn?
Well, he's asking if I'd kill a man for some corn.
Here's another example of where you mentioned he threatens his life, but ultimately he's going to, as we'll see, let him go again. This time accusing him of murdering him and his fellow citizens of Jones County, Mississippi.
200 men.
Maybe 100. It's hard to say. They made us lie face down in the dirt.
The Confederate officer sitting here, the Major Amos McLemore was his name, and he was a real-life individual who had various violent encounters with the Night Company, as it would become known. And we'll get more into later on his fate and how it matches up with how it's depicted in the film.
And now he's getting pretty bold.
Daring them to come into Sherwood Forest.
Mm-hmm.
What he says, Ward, is how you ain't a nigga. I mean, they just pick cotton for him. You was willing to get killed for him.
Of passive-aggressive conversations that play out highlight the fact that some people are incapable of finding empathy in the same way that
Right.
Newt does, because the institutionalized racism is so pervasive. It was not only in the South, but the North as well. But some people simply have an inability to see African Americans as humans,
Right.
let alone somebody capable of fighting alongside them on any sort of equal level.
I think it also kind of shows a little bit of that breakdown in what will come to be known as the Night Company, and on a much larger scale, as you mentioned, even up north, where some people are fighting for, say, Jones County's independence from Mississippi or the Confederacy. Others are fighting for, their African American counterparts that are out there in the swamp with them. And it shows kind of the complexities of this kind of new society that's being born out of the Civil War.
We can run anything through that blockade, but the whiskey always seems to get here first.
There's a reference here made to the naval blockade, with you formerly working at a coastal national park that looks at a lot of these issues. What was the effectiveness of blockade runners and the like? Were they meeting success by this point in 1863?
Off and on, but it's very hard for these blockade runners to get through, as you have the Atlantic, the Southern Atlantic blockading squadron from the coast of North Carolina all the way down to Florida. However, they are pretty well spread apart. It of course does drive the price up on some of these things that he's looking for. In this particular instance here, all the way out in Mississippi. So the effectiveness of the blockade is at best. We're starting to see here the retaliation against Knight and his men and their families. Of course, if they can't go into quote-unquote Sherwood Forest and get them, then they're going to try and draw them out through means of these terrible acts of burning their property, affecting their families who are waiting for them on the outside.
Yeah, why would you trust someone that just burned your farm, son?
It's also worth mentioning, when we consider notions of property, that the Confederate States of America instituted conscription before the United States government did.
Right.
The Confederate government was taking and confiscating enslaved people before the United States military was.
Right.
And so in some ways, the Confederacy becomes the very thing that they claim to be fighting against. You have domineering national government taking your property away for the national cause. And so it leads to this big question: would they have been better off preserving their institution had they not fired on Fort Sumter?
Right.
So it's all sorts of weird hypotheticals like that you can think of.
So here we see the fate of some of those, in particular the older guy, the father, kind of the dissenters in Knight's company, what happens to them when they leave the safety of the swamp. This kind of shows, I think, too, that, if Knight and his men were to come out of the swamp and try to peacefully surrender, would this likewise be their fates?
And hangings like this did occur. They are recorded in Bynum's book, Free State of Jones. And accordingly, it is going to further escalate this sort of seesaw of violence that is continuously unfolding.
Somehow, some way, at some time, everybody is just somebody else's nigger. Mr. Moses, are you a...
No, I'm not.
Then what are you?
Free man, Captain.
Why's that?
Because you cannot own a child of God.
You can own a horse, you can own a mule, or a cow, or an ox, but you cannot own a child of God.
I think this is correct me if I'm wrong, the first conversation in the movie held between Knight and some of the African Americans in kind of his group here in the swamp, where he is, vocally opposing the institution of slavery. You can't own a person, or as Moses puts it, you can't own a child of God.
Mm-hmm. Just goes to show, when you start interacting with people who don't look like you and come from different backgrounds than you, it leads to all sorts of realizations about commonality and common humanity. I think that's one of the great messages of the film, that ultimately the film is this advocate for a biracial democracy. That was that was the dream of Reconstruction, and it wasn't fully realized. And appropriately enough, this movie comes out in 2016, just a few months before the presidential election, when so many of these ideas about access to voting and racial
a lot of those
imparity
themes of Reconstruction really start to come back to light for the general American public.
Mm-hmm. It's around the time that your former park is created as well. So
about a year later.
Very pertinent indeed. Bynum writes of an ambush taking place on the Confederate troops here in Jones County. Was it this dramatic? Did you have women pulling out pistols from underneath
during a funeral
their
service?
Black shawls during a funeral service? It perhaps wasn't quite this jaw-dropping, but this is a really neat scene, though.
Yeah.
It's I think it's one of the better choreographed fighting scenes in the movie, just because of the shock value of it. People aren't expecting it. When students see this part in the class, they're like, "Yeah, let them have it." Some people ready for some bloodlust by this point in the movie. But this is a prime example of where a lot of different events and personalities are overlapped for the sake of condensing the story, bringing all these different converging points together. And that leads us to this final showdown with the Major that we're going to see here in a moment.
You knew not. I knew your daddy.
What do we know about the fate of Amos McElmore?
So the Major did not meet his end in this ambush as we see here. I mean, it's a very vindictive, somewhat satisfying end here as far as the vengeance formula goes. But all in all, McElmore on the night of October 5th, 1863, was visiting the home of a Confederate congressman by the name of Amos Deason. And unlike what we see here, I think by and large we can call Major Macklemore's fate an assassination.
Oh, wow.
Someone pretty much shot him through a window in Deason's home. And there's speculation, was Knight the one who pulled the trigger?
We don't know.
So it's like less, I don't want to call this heroic because he's essentially lynching the guy in a church pew. But it's more shrouded in mystery.
Right.
It kind of more of a cloak and dagger sort of fate that the Major meets. So here too, another example of things being compacted.
Right.
Get up here in front! We need more power! Keep pushing, boys! Fire!
Here we are in March of 1864, Ellisville, Mississippi. A somewhat urban battle does take place here in this capacity. Our good friend Gary Edelman with the American Battlefield Trust just recently did a great breakdown on Civil War combat scenes for Insider on YouTube. And this is one of the scenes that he takes a look at. We'll include the link to that video in the caption below, and you can hear another Civil War historian's thoughts on this particular combat scene. But one of the things that he raises, the likelihood of, shrapnel, like in the canister sort of formula, hitting a powder supply, making it blow sky high like that.
Well, in this case, they're loading utensils and random scraps of metal.
Yeah, that stuff isn't going to detonate a,
right.
a supply of gunpowder.
Ho! Ho! Hands up!
Up.
I really enjoy this scene because it underscores the potentials of what the Civil War can be for these people as they're waging it.
I think it's very reminiscent of what happens earlier in the war, about 2 years earlier in Port Royal Sound, South Carolina, when you have plantation owners and enslavers and Confederate troops driven out by the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army in a combined effort, while, these people, the people who had claimed ownership of other human beings, leaving the area within a week time span, as we see that kind of compacted, as you mentioned, with the vacancy of that plantation house.
Fun cinematic side point, that plantation was also used as the plantation for Big Daddy in Django Unchained. This makes sense. This movie was filmed in Louisiana. I don't think any of this at all was filmed in Mississippi, believe it or not.
Right.
It's filmed in the greater New Orleans area. We see some historical scenery that we've seen in other films as well being incorporated here.
How long will it take it to get there?
3-4 days, if there's no patrols.
Tell Sherman we hold everything from the Pascagoula to the Alabama border. Tell him we need some artillery, 20 pieces.
So if this is in the spring of 1864, they're talking about General Sherman trying to reach out to him. Sherman's mighty busy preparing for some big offensives here going into the summer of 1864, with his mind, above all else, on capturing Atlanta.
I think something interesting about this scene is we were kind of talking about a little bit ago about this kind of white saviorism of some of these movies. Knight is introducing Rachel to something that she probably felt was always out of reach, which is the kind of the big house and feeling a feather bed for the first time. Of course, as we'll see here, it brings her to tears.
Yeah, it's a life not lived.
Right.
It's the other side of the line that she never thought that she would be able to experience. The fact that something as fine as a feather bed, something so comfortable, has always been out of her reach. I think it's a very poignant scene.
Yeah,
it says so much with no dialogue being said whatsoever.
Right.
So an interesting little cameo here. We aren't actually formally introduced to the man walking away from the dining room table, but that's supposed to be Leonidas Polk.
Really?
The audience is informed of Colonel Lowry sending troops. We aren't really formally introduced to Colonel Lowry as well. It's just his name just kind of pops up in this caption.
As just Colonel Lowry. Right?
Yeah. So that is in reference to Robert Lowry, who was one of the real-life Confederate officers assigned with the task of rooting out these bands of guerrilla fighters. And so he, as the caption indicates, was responsible for launching an offensive of sorts against the Night Company.
Now, do we have evidence that U.S. forces actually sent muskets into the town of Ellisville, into Jones County?
I believe they did.
Okay.
I think, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it is rather proportionate to what they allude to here in the film.
And affirm the following principles. Number one, no man ought to stay poor so another man can get rich. Number two, no man ought to tell another man what he's got to live for or what he's got to die for. Number three, what you put in the ground is yours to tend and harvest, and ain't no man ought to be able to take that away from you. Number four, every man's a man.
I think what's interesting about that scene is you're seeing the people of Jones County kind of, in a way, aligning with Lincoln's Emancipation, the proclamation that went into effect on January 1st, 1863, but almost taking it a step further in declaring the equality of all the people that are living here in Jones County as well.
I think something else to think about, too, is something that we often say here on Real History, and that's the fact that movies are a reflection of the time in which they are made as much as the time period that they represent.
Right.
And so it leads to all of these questions in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, conversations about economic inequality and inequity in American society. And this movie taps into those sorts of sentiments that were being had in the 2010s.
And here we see the transition into the Reconstruction era in 1865.
Yeah, more black and white photos. You see Moses being reunited with his family, which is very true to form. Certainly wasn't always easy because sometimes people were hundreds of miles apart.
Right.
But this was one of the potentials, one of the promises of emancipation.
Well, it's one of the things that the Freedmen's Bureau created in early 1865 is kind of one of their roles is trying to reunite some of these families that maybe were thousands of miles apart, hundreds of miles apart. And here we're seeing Moses on his own property, which I think was the dream of so many millions of African Americans during Reconstruction. Owning property is one of those steps towards citizenship in this country.
But we won.
I know.
And they said, General Sherman, he said...
I know what they said.
He said 40 acres and a mule. For every freed man and their families.
They took that back.
Who did?
President did. There's a new president now named Johnson.
The conversation we see taking place right here in this shed between Knight and Moses and some of the other men of Jones County is about William Tecumseh Sherman's 40 acres and a mule, which came through with orders number 15 in early 1865 from Savannah, Georgia, basically stating that free African Americans or freed African Americans that are settling on these 40-acre plots of land can eventually claim ownership of that property as well. What we're seeing in that scene is something that I don't think I've ever seen portrayed on film before, which is that land being stripped away from them, that promise of Reconstruction being taken away and returned to folks like this, the white plantation owner who had previously fled.
In just a few short bits of dialogue, I think they perfectly encapsulate the ups and downs of Reconstruction.
Right.
Promises being made, promises being broken. Who do you trust?
Right.
These are some of the big questions emerging here in 1865 and 1866 as Andrew Johnson is taking office
and
steering the country in a very different direction
right.
from what Abraham Lincoln envisioned.
And that's something they're kind of trying to grapple with, to come to terms with, as Knight mentions. We've got a new president now. It's not Abraham Lincoln any longer. It's Andrew Johnson.
Yeah.
And of course, his policy is much more reconciliatory in approach.
They took him. They took our boy.
Who did?
Bunch of men from Eakins first thing this morning. So he got a gun.
It ain't your fight.
I'm going with you.
You his daddy now?
Sir.
Huh? I'm his daddy. It's my boy.
It's your boy. I'm going with you, Moses.
It's the only help I need right here.
I'm going with you. They'll arrest me. They'll kill you.
Can't nobody own my boy now.
Some really good dialogue here, summing up these loopholes like apprenticeship laws, where people could essentially be kidnapped and forced into servitude under the guise of, like, oh, it's an internship, like we're giving them
we're teaching
a step
them
in life
skills.
Yeah,
right.
Which is just all code for slavery 2.0 or slavery light.
Slavery by a different name.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is happening all throughout the South during Reconstruction. You're seeing freed children basically being essentially kidnapped. And that's why right here they show 1 year after quote
emancipation.
Emancipation, being essentially re-enslaved. They're having to refer to their employer as master again. So they're trying to even revert back to that language they were used to during the time of slavery when it was legal.
And so much of this transitions into sharecropping. And there were many poor white folks that found themselves as sharecroppers as well, where you're getting a pittance of the profit from the land that you're cultivating, and you get to live on the property for free, in exchange. But it comes at such a high cost.
Right.
Hold it! Where you going with that boy?
Taking him home.
We got papers on that boy.
Papers?
So as we're seeing here too, of course, these apprenticeship laws are local laws that are being passed and enforced by a lot of the people who once called them property before and during the Civil War.
And here we see Lieutenant Barber. He's like a bad cold.
The defendant, Newton Knight, did on November 14th, 1865, intervene and interfere in the lawful apprenticeship of a Negro child in violation of Mississippi law.
He keeps coming back. And this sort of depiction, even though Barber's fictional, I think it is such a great representation, showing how, just freedom's kind of dangled in front of people. And then you have these traitors, former Confederate officers being put back in charge under the conciliatory means facilitated by the likes of Andrew Johnson. Right. And
this is kind of the result of Johnson's policy on the ground level. This is kind of how it's playing out across the South.
It leads to a really fascinating conversation that I think historians can and should have. What is the greater good or greater evil of being conciliatory toward your former enemy and rebuilding the country in the name of politics versus holding Confederates accountable for their crimes to ensure that they can't regain power or that something like this can't happen again? What's the greater good, the greater evil in the long term? Holding the Union together or ensuring a greater degree of racial equality?
Right. An interesting conversation, as you mentioned, that historians should have, is Johnson following this reconciliatory policy at the expense of African Americans? Absolutely. Sure, for a short period of time, Confederates are stripped of their right to vote. But, of course, for a while, African Americans are too. And as we'll see in the 1870s, things take a turn. But I think when, for the sake of reconciliation, he's accepting them back in completely, especially when a lot of the wealthy plantation owners can come and offer a formal apology. That's when things really start to turn south.
It is. Right here. Congress just passed an amendment to the United States Constitution.
The scene we're seeing right here, of course, is the local Union League chapter.
Meeting in the church.
Meeting in the church as well. And, of course, this is a movement that began in the North during the Civil War and starts to spread throughout the South, a majority of the chapters of the Union League being made up of freed African Americans.
Looking at this scene, it's also important to acknowledge the fact, if we move almost a century ahead, as we look at places like Birmingham in the 1950s and the 1960s, where are these civil rights organizations meeting?
Churches.
They're meeting in their churches.
Right.
We see the beginning of a really fine tradition here.
But we're also seeing, as with this scene, this is kind of the early rendition of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Which begins almost immediately after the Civil War. We're seeing these African American steps toward not just freedom but equality, and with every step forward during Reconstruction, there's these steps against them.
It's a
burning their meeting
of war.
place, burning black churches and schools. This is a very realistic scene of this acts of hatred and racial terrorism that are unfolding in the late 1860s into the 1870s and onward.
You ain't got to fill it out now. I'll fill it out for you.
Then when I register.
You get to vote. You get to vote Republican, you get to vote for black folks.
Vote for black folks.
Yes, sir. Black judges, maybe even a black sheriff.
So right here, I think is one of the more powerful scenes in the movie, kind of the hopes of Reconstruction being portrayed on film, where Moses is going around to the African-American population of Jones County, Mississippi, and registering them for the vote. You mentioned earlier, what was the white plantation owners' biggest fear during and before the Civil War? Carrying arms. After the war, for them, that same class of people, it's black men having the vote. And even when the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, it wasn't necessarily offering the right to vote for black men across the country. That doesn't come until 1870 with the passing of the 15th Amendment. But, men like Moses, guys who are encouraging other African Americans to cast their vote, as well as teachers of free people throughout the South, are being targeted, as we'll see in this scene right here.
You know your age?
I'm 30.
30 years old. What's your last name?
Davis.
Davis. And what about you? What about your father? What's your mama's name?
A primary source that I often share with students in the classroom, there's a white Canadian missionary who moved south, and for merely educating the formerly enslaved to read and write, he's ultimately executed, and the Klan allows him to write a final note before they lynch him.
Right.
And he fully, still, even on the verge of his death, believes in the conviction that he is doing the right thing, but he also acknowledges that he's paying the highest price possible for his convictions. And unfortunately, that is what happens to our composite character of Moses here.
As you can see, the papers that his wife is picking up off the ground is from, I believe, his ledger, where he's been registering all these black men to vote around the county of Jones. And as we see here, we have the weathered and tired night coming upon the body of his friend Moses, who, as we mentioned, was lynched by these locals. I think this powerful scene, of course, is reflected throughout the American South between the 1860s into the 20th century. There's confirmed cases of thousands of African Americans being lynched publicly between Reconstruction and civil rights. And those are just the ones that we know about. There's many, of course, that likely aren't documented and published in the papers.
And the accounts are so horrific. For measure, they would sometimes burn bodies. Later on in the 20th century, photographers came out and photographed them. And you see, like, kids.
You see groups of hundreds and maybe thousands of people
smiling, like, "Oh, look what I did last weekend." Turn it into postcards.
Into a public spectacle.
Yeah. But one of the really horrific things that we see befall Moses here, you see the blood running down his leg, which hints at the fact that he was castrated, maybe even before he was killed. So he's literally and figuratively having his manhood stripped away from him as he is trying to prove that he is a man, that he is worthy of the right to vote. So it's a hard, grueling scene.
I will say I think that scene also is, Hollywood forcing the larger public who, may not read into history quite as much, may not read into Reconstruction quite as much, having to come to terms with something that actually did happen across the American South, happened on our own soil right here, and it wasn't that long ago.
Don't seem too American for an election to be over before it starts, does it?
Nope. And of course, here we're seeing Election Day. I mentioned the 15th Amendment being passed in 1870. These African American men, for the first time in their lives, have the right to vote, have a right to put someone in office who maybe has their best interests in mind. Does it play out the way that they had anticipated? We'll see here in a little bit.
Just the Democrat tickets.
We'll wait.
Might be a pretty long wait.
We see the guy cracking the peanuts here, and we know that he's the one who killed Moses. A pile of peanut shells
beneath his body, right?
But what are we seeing here as they're going in to cast their ballots?
I think we're seeing a scene play out that had played out all across the American South during Reconstruction, especially when a lot of these African American men are voting for the very first time. We're seeing opposition and tension in the polling place. We see these guys right here actually trying to actively deny them the vote. And usually through acts of trickery, or saying, well, we don't have any Republican tickets for you to vote here today. And of course, we see Knight telling him, well, these guys have a lot more to lose than you do if you want to go the route of violence. And unfortunately, violence does play a major role in a lot of these election days we see across the South. And as we saw with the final count, we saw there was a lot more than 2 black Republicans in that polling office. So, the end result is, through acts of trickery or flat out denying them the vote, they're able to work toward the defeat of Reconstruction. One thing I like to emphasize is that Reconstruction was not a failure. If it was allowed to go unobstructed moving forward, we might have had a much different result. But through intimidation and the polls, through active intimidation, murder, violence, assaults we just saw in that previous scene with the Klan, that's really how these former Confederates, white supremacists across the country are actively working to bring Reconstruction to an end.
I don't want him to drop his eyes every time a white man walks by. I don't want him to be a boy no more once he turns into a man. Don't you want that too?
And of course, here in this conversation between Rachel and Knight, this is a conversation I think was taking place in many homes, especially in the 1870s, especially in African-American households, where people are now thinking, okay, well, do we just pick up our things and move north? Is there maybe more work up north, but also potentially not having to face the violence with which they're met, out in the countryside, through groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Red Shirts, the White League, etc.
I understand your client wishes to change his plea, Counselor.
Yes, he does, Your Honor.
Your Honor, I'm not changing my plea, because I'm not guilty of anything.
Young man, I don't appreciate these games, and I am tempted to rescind your bail right now. Bailiff will take the defendant into custody. Bail is hereby rescinded.
Your Honor.
You missed your chance, Mr. Oakes.
I love you, honey.
So the anti-miscegenation laws at the time indicated that if your ancestry was 1/8 African American, then you were in fact African American.
Right.
And that is what they nabbed Davis Knight for here in 1948. I think scenes and scenarios like this are helpful in the classroom because it demonstrates to us that the actions of our ancestors can have big implications on how we live our lives today, and I think that's an important reminder. But ultimately, the state Supreme Court overturned the decision because they couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt, in their view, that Davis Knight was in fact,
Right.
1/8 African American.
Here we're seeing with these end credits, Knight, the actual Knight, who does kind of bear a little bit of a resemblance to Matthew McConaughey. And we're seeing him with, I believe, his son.
I'm not sure if it's his son or his grandson. All right, so there we have it, Free State of Jones. What do you think is the one big weakness of the film? What's the one big strength of the movie?
I think the biggest weakness, as we kind of tackled early on, is they definitely could have used perhaps a historical advisor or a military advisor when kind of going through some of the Civil War scenes, especially Corinth, or even the fighting in Ellisville. However, I think the biggest strength was it was storytelling. And of course, with most Hollywood movies, there's some liberties taken trying to fill in some of those gaps for things that we don't know. And there's a lot that we don't know about the story of Newton Knight and his relationship with the African-American community of Jones County, Mississippi. But I think my personal favorite strength of the movie is kind of the timeline of events. For someone that might not be a historian or be as familiar with, say, Reconstruction and the Civil War, they do a pretty good job of putting everything in chronological order, but also when it comes to kind of summarizing Reconstruction on film. This is, I think, maybe the first time I had seen a film that actually makes an attempt at doing that and kind of tackling all the things like citizenship and voting and land ownership and all those major themes of Reconstruction, but also tackling all of the opposition to Reconstruction with groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Also, those different loopholes during Reconstruction established by former Confederates, by office holders, forcing people to carry papers to move freely around, forcing young children into these apprenticeship roles. So I think it kind of, as best as it can do, I think, tackles the successes in the hopes of Reconstruction, but also the opposition against it as well.
And to your point, I think the film takes a lot of liberties with the micro elements of the story, personal interactions and composite characters and so on and so forth. But as far as the macro narrative is concerned, I think it conveys a fairly accurate representation.
I do too. I'd agree with you on that. And as we were kind of alluding to earlier, the author of the book, The Free State of Jones, is very focused on the genealogy of Newton Knight, which I think is kind of tied in throughout the film, of course. Probably doesn't tackle it quite as hard as she does in the book, but we start to see kind of the seeds planted for what happens later on in the 20th century with his descendant. I think, well, of course, this coming out in 2016? I think maybe it was a little bit ahead of its time. Personally, I think it was ahead of its time. I think...
Yet at the same time, we've waited so long for an accurate representation of Reconstruction.
I think, when people think about Reconstruction, they're thinking about that rebuilding of the country in a literal sense. But as I mentioned, it's on a much different plane. It's on a much different level, that we're now reconstructing the country or refounding the country much different than it would have been in, say, 1861. 13th Amendment, you have the abolishment of slavery in this country with the exception of punishment for a crime. And that's a whole other conversation where there's many loopholes that are found in that amendment. The 14th Amendment, of course, is offering equality under the law and birthright citizenship in this country. So African Americans, for example, this composite character Moses, during the war and even after the war, right after the war, is not considered a citizen of the United States. That doesn't come until the passing of the 14th Amendment. The third being the 15th Amendment that I'd mentioned earlier, passed in 1870, offering the right to vote for African American men. We're recreating this country. There's now 4 million plus people who were once considered property in the eyes of the law, who were seen as eventually second-class citizens, who were helping refound this country. That is Reconstruction, when you kind of boil it down. I think this film does a pretty good job of kind of tackling all those themes. I don't know in 2016 if people were ready to come to terms with that. There was a lot happening at the time, though. A year before, in 2015, for example, you have the murder of 9 parishioners and their, 9 members of the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Not long after that, you have the Confederate battle flag being pulled down from the State House in Columbia, South Carolina. All these things are tying back to Reconstruction. And you really can't deny that.
You have Charlottesville the year after.
Right.
The film. Yeah.
And all this is happening, building up to the release of the Free State of Jones. Why exactly wasn't this popular at the time it came out? As I mentioned, I think it's ahead of its time, but what's your take on that?
I think people see enough of it on the news. They don't want to have it reinforced when they go to the movie theaters. People want escapism.
That makes sense.
When they go to the theaters, they don't want a lecture, perhaps on history or our shortcomings as a nation, because we see it play out daily on the internet and on television. So I think it would be better off if we do come to terms and if Hollywood can help facilitate that. But that's just me as a historian.
I would have to 100% agree. But, if we've learned anything, it's when you kind of throw a mirror in front of people, they don't necessarily always like what they see. They'd rather throw a sheet over it. What we've seen since the release of this movie in 2016 is, of course, much... Has kind of run very parallel to Reconstruction. Of course, with the 2020 election into 2021, almost every day you're going online or watching the news, you're seeing Reconstruction being referenced. Of course, January 6, 2021, we're seeing the storming of the Capitol, which is a scene that's playing out or being threatened across the South in the 1876 election. And really was kind of a turning point in this country's history. One of the most contested elections in American history, I think, until 2020. So I think the release of the Free State of Jones was very, very timely, as we're starting to see play out now.
Absolutely. Plenty of good food for thought.
Absolutely.
That concludes this episode of Real History. We hope that we were able to offer some helpful insight on this very rocky time period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Rich, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we will have the links to some of his social media outlets pertaining to Civil War history in the caption below. Please feel free to check those out. Thank you once again for joining us, and until we see you next time on Real History, stay curious.